Veronica, the name means true icon. That Veronica showed the true face of Christ. When she put the handkerchief or the cloth on his face to wipe his blood and sweat and tears, the imprint of his face remained on the cloth. Now this is a very, very moving feature of iconography, of pictures, Christian pictures, Christian illustrations. But what does it teach us? What does it show us? That if we look into the suffering face of Christ, we see our face. He suffered all of this for us. He saw us. Now we can see him. In our suffering we can see him. You can, at night, before you sleep, after you've had a hard day, in the midst of some terrible circumstance, some distressing, some grinding down suffering, you can put your cloth on your face and you can weep and you can connect to Jesus. Do not be afraid to connect your suffering to the suffering of Christ. We will talk about hope, we will talk about new creation, we will talk about the joys of Christianity, but let us not forget that at the bottom, underlying all our suffering, is the suffering of Christ with which we are identified by Simon, by Veronica, the people who showed us that Christ's suffering has a power to help us, to accompany us, to lift us. Not to take it away, not to smooth it away, not to say, oh, it's a mistake, we can erase it. No, we cannot erase suffering from our lives. But we can carry our suffering as our cross, with the cross of Christ as our model, as our vehicle. We come to the place where Jesus was stripped, preparatory to being nailed on the cross. The humiliation of Christ, being crucified naked among two thieves, nailed to the cross, not tied by ropes, but nailed. The extremity, the extremis of his suffering. You might say that I have been there. How many people, victims of oppression, victims of racial oppression, victims of sexual oppression, victims of war, have suffered as much as Christ? So many people, young girls, victims of rape, they have suffered what Christ has suffered. Soldiers who have come back as half men, legs blown off, arms blown off, they have suffered what Christ suffered. Political prisoners, tortured, they have suffered what Christ suffered. Not less, the same. But what are the difference? All of these victims did it and suffered without hope. But Christ suffered deliberately, voluntarily. No one suffers voluntarily. No one says, I want to go and have my leg blown off. But Jesus said, I want to have my body crucified on the cross to save my people. And he saw each one of us. As he was in Thursday night in the garden, why did he sweat blood? No one sweats blood. But Christ sweated blood because of the millions of suffering people he was redeeming at that moment. So the extreme humiliation of Christ on the cross connects him to the most difficult, the most lost cases among us. Not all of us have to suffer such extreme cases, but those among us who do, and those whom we know, among our families and our friends, we can help them by connecting their suffering to the suffering of Christ. We have Christ's death and his taking down from the cross. This is like an end point. People die. Everyone dies. We all die. Our friends die. Our families die. The older we get, the more people around us we see die. And the first person we see die when we are young, perhaps a grandmother, a grandfather, perhaps an accident in the street. But everyone sees death at some point. And Jesus died. There is nothing that happens to us that Jesus did not experience. And Paul said, we do not have a high priest who doesn't know what we are feeling. We have a high priest who was like us in everything, who suffered everything that we suffer. but without temptation, without falling into temptation. So, or into sin. So, the death of Christ is something real. And when you feel somebody, when you know somebody who dies, seemingly without the consolation of religion, when people die and they are in the church, they're in the family of Christ, and their funerals are celebrated with hymns and mass, this is wonderful. But when people die in the street, lost and forgotten, when people die because of accidents, when people die unexpectedly, is their death not counted? No, it is counted. Christ died for all. So, suffering, sin, temptation, death, all these things are embedded in the cross of Christ. Nothing that happens to us is not touched by the cross. The cross connects us to Christ, who lifts us, who heals us, who helps us as we suffer. People say, why did God allow this to happen to me? I've heard this question so many times. Why did God allow this? God doesn't allow suffering. Suffering exists because of our sinfulness. If no one fell in temptation, there would be no suffering. But we all fall. God invites us to recover from such a fall. And what is the greatest invitation of all? It is the cross. Now, when I came with the boys to cement these crosses into the earth, we put two of them a little bit closer and one a little bit farther away. I don't know if this has any historical precedent, but I wanted to do it like that for this very reason, that the good thief, Demas, the thief who sympathized with Christ, who said to him, Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. This thief connected himself to Christ. As I've been suggesting, we should connect ourselves to Christ in his suffering. So on the cross, one of the thieves said, yes, I accept your suffering, my Christ. He didn't say, I wish I hadn't come here. That was the cry of this jealous one, who didn't want to be suffering, who didn't want to have this terrible end. He wanted to be taken away, to be released. He said, why don't you save us and me too? He was still thinking of himself. But this thief, and I love to stand with this cross and to consider my Christ as helping me to help him. All of us, we can help Christ to carry his cross as we carry our cross. He helps us to carry our cross. So I like to come and stand on the top of this hill when I finish the meditation and to see all of this mountain around, all of this beautiful, beautiful valley, all of this area, and to understand that in the middle of it is a cross. In the middle of it now I have put the cross of Christ. And this cross reminds me that it was only through the suffering that we reach the glory. And I ask all my Christian brothers and sisters to remember that when you are in your much more busy, much more temptation-filled world, when you are suffering so many more extreme occasions than I face here on the mountain, that you have the same help, you have the same Christ, the same cross, which lifts me, which lifts you. So let us remember this Easter, and let us remember all our lives, that it's day by day that we carry our cross. It's not once only, not a once off. It's all our life to the end. And the end is, today you will be with me in paradise.